The discovery police made inside an apartment in Englewood, Colorado in the spring of 2023 was said to be one of the most gruesome they had encountered in decades. It started with a phone call.
I found my daughter and my wife. Somebody killed them in the apartment.
The dispatcher paused, asked him to repeat himself, and 81-year-old Reginald McLaren, calm, measured, and completely in control of his voice, said it again. When Englewood police officers arrived at Apartment N308 of the ArtWalk Apartments on Englewood Parkway that evening, they were responding to a double homicide. But even the veterans on that force, men and women who had spent decades processing the worst that human beings do to one another, were not prepared for what they walked into. The first thing they noticed wasn't the blood. It was the garbage cans. Two large, upright, brand-new plastic bins sitting in the middle of a living room. No scuffs, no dirt, no signs of a single prior use. Just two clean black bins positioned next to a sofa that was soaked through with blood. The officer who first laid eyes on them stopped walking. The body cam caught what he said next before anyone thought to reach for the off switch. 2 words, nothing more. But those 2 words said everything that needed to be said about what was inside those bins. Division Chief Tracy Jones would later stand in front of a press conference microphone and tell the world that her detectives, some of them 20-year veterans, described this as one of the most gruesome crime scenes they had ever been a part of, that the department was actively providing mental health resources to every officer who had stepped foot inside N308. But the true horror of that apartment was not just what was inside those bins. It was the man standing calmly in the hallway, pointing fingers at gang-banging nephews, performing grief, weaving a story about an intruder who had tried to carry the bodies out and given up halfway, because what investigators were about to discover would reframe everything. There was a Home Depot receipt, dated 2 full weeks before the murders, a receipt for a handsaw for 2 large plastic bins, and a separate purchase, an axe. This is not a story about a crime of passion. This is not a story about a breakdown or a moment of temporary madness. This is a story about a man who lived for 14 days in the same apartment as the 2 women he had already decided were going to die, cooking meals with them, watching television with them, sleeping under the same roof, with the tools of their destruction stored quietly in a closet near the boiler room. And it all cracked open because a neighbor noticed one small, almost throwaway detail in a casual conversation. Reginald McLaren had stopped saying we. He was only saying I. Englewood, Colorado sits comfortably in the Denver metro area, close enough to the city to feel connected, close enough to the Rocky Mountains to feel grounded. It is a city built around community, diverse, growing, the kind of place where people put down roots and stay. The ArtWalk Apartments on Englewood Parkway were exactly the kind of building that reflected that spirit. Neighbors who knew each other, residents who noticed when something felt off, a community within a community. And inside Apartment N308 lived a family that by every account from every person on that floor embodied exactly what that community was supposed to look like. Bethany McLaren, known to those closest to her by her Nepali name, Pavitra, was not an ordinary woman by any measure. Born in a small hill town in eastern India, she had attended a Christian missionary school as a child before launching one of the most quietly remarkable careers you could imagine. She joined the United States Army as a nurse. She worked with the kind of disciplined, purposeful intensity that doesn't make noise about itself. She studied, she served, she advanced. She retired with the rank of captain. In 1986, she married Reginald McLaren, and together they built a life in Denver. A year later, they had Ruth. Ruth Jennifer McLaren had spent her entire life fighting her own body and refusing to let it define her ceiling. Cerebral palsy, epilepsy, conditions that made the physical mechanics of daily life genuinely hard in ways that most people will never understand. But mentally, intellectually, emotionally, In terms of sheer force of ambition, Ruth was formidable. She was studying law, working toward a dream she had carried for years, to become an attorney who represented people the system had decided weren't worth fighting for, people who reminded her, in many ways, of herself. The neighbors remembered the Maclarens in the specific, affectionate way that people remember those who made a building feel like a place worth living. They talked about the smells that drifted from the open door of N308 when Bethany was cooking, rich, fragrant, the kind of cooking that makes a hallway feel like a home. They described the family as quiet, polite, deeply bonded to one another. Nobody had a single bad word. And inside that apartment, behind that open, welcoming door, the man of the household had already made his decision. He had already taken a trip to Home Depot. He had already placed the axe and the saw and the bins in the closet near the boiler. He was simply waiting for the morning he had already chosen. In the hours immediately following the 911 call, while crime scene investigators processed the nightmare inside N308, detectives began working the building, knocking on doors, asking questions, looking for anyone who had seen or heard anything unusual. They found Will. Will was one of the very few residents of the ArtWalk Apartments who had any kind of regular conversation with Reginald. Not a close friendship, but the kind of building-neighbor relationship where you exchange words in the parking garage, where you recognize each other well enough to make small talk. And Will remembered a conversation from a day or two before the murders that, in hindsight, landed like a brick. Reginald had approached him and asked a favor. He told Will that he was moving out on Saturday, March 25th, the very day he would call 911, and asked if Will could accept a key drop after hours in case the timing ran late. Will had agreed without much thought. Moving out, fine, nothing unusual about that. But then Reginald had said something else. He mentioned going overseas. He talked about the move in terms of his own plans, his own future, his own next chapter. He said, I. Not we're moving, not we're going overseas, not the family is relocating, just I. Will noticed it at the time as slightly odd. By the time he was sitting across from a detective that evening, he understood exactly what it meant. In the weeks leading up to the murders of his wife and daughter, Reginald McLaren had already excised them from his future tense. They no longer existed in his plans. The we of the McLaren family had become an I, and he had been saying it out loud without realizing he was handing anyone a key. But the singular slip was only the beginning of what investigators were building. A neighbor from directly across the hallway had a functioning Ring doorbell camera, and that camera had been watching the corridor outside N308 all day on March 25th. Reginald had told police he had been absent from the apartment for a couple of hours and returned to discover the bodies. The footage showed something categorically different. It showed Reginald leaving the apartment at 3:55 in the afternoon, walking calmly to his vehicle in the parking lot, returning almost immediately and locking the apartment door behind him on the way back in. A 30-second trip to the car, nothing more. If he had discovered his murdered wife and daughter at 3 o'clock, why was he calmly locking his door and walking to his car at 4 o'clock? Why did he not call 911 until 6 o'clock in the evening? What happened inside that apartment during those 2 silent hours? When officers located Reginald's white sedan in the building parking lot, they found the back seats folded completely flat, not folded for moving boxes, for something longer, something heavier, something that needed to lie horizontal. The investigation had its direction, and it was pointing at one person. The clinical investigative quality of the crime scene had been bothering investigators since the moment they first walked through the door. The axe, recovered from the closet near the boiler, bloodied, unwiped, as though the person who used it had run out of something before they could finish what they started. The handsaw beside it. And those bins, Those immaculate, brand new, not a mark on them plastic bins that had been used for something no bin was ever designed to hold. Detectives polled the local Home Depot's purchase records. They were not looking for a transaction from the morning of March 25th. They were not expecting to find panic buying in the aftermath of something that had gone wrong. What they found instead stopped them cold. March 9th. 2 weeks and 2 days before the murders, Reginald McLaren had walked into a Home Depot wearing a mask, moved through the aisles with the unhurried purpose of a man running a routine errand, selected 2 large plastic bins, continued to the tool section, pulled a handsaw from the rack, and taken everything to the checkout. A store clerk remembered him, remembered the bins specifically, large enough that she had made conversation about them, asking whether the city wasn't providing trash cans for him. Reginald had muttered something she couldn't quite catch and moved on, not in a hurry, not agitated. Store cameras then showed him making a separate stop for an axe. The ring camera at the apartment building caught him returning that day with his purchases. He carried them inside. He placed them in the closet near the boiler room. He closed the closet door. And then he went back to living in that apartment with his wife and his daughter for 14 more days. 14 days of dinners. 14 days of Ruth studying her law textbooks at the kitchen table. 14 days of Bethany moving through the apartment she had made into a home, while in the closet near the boiler, an axe and a saw and 2 plastic bins waited for the morning Reginald had already decided on. This was not a crime of passion. There was no passion in it at all. This was the coldest possible category of premeditated murder, planned with a calendar, executed with a receipt, and lived alongside for 2 weeks without a tremor of hesitation. By the time detectives sat down with Reginald at the Swedish Medical Center, where he had been transported after complaining of chest pains following the 911 call, the nephew story was already in ruins. The camera footage, the receipt, the car, the timeline that simply did not hold together no matter which way you turned it. When confronted with what investigators had assembled, Reginald McLaren abandoned his narrative, and what he replaced it with was something that drained the room. He explained that he had recently lost his job at a hospital shared services center. At 81 years old, unemployed, he had been watching the money run out and the prospect of eviction become increasingly real. He had spent years working with homeless individuals through his job. He knew, he said, what that life looked like, what it felt like, what it cost a person's dignity. He told the detectives that he did not want Ruth, with her cerebral palsy, her epilepsy, her physical needs, to suffer that indignity. He did not want Bethany, the captain, the woman who had given decades of service and built a life from a childhood in a hill town in eastern India, to experience that humiliation. He told them he knew they were in a better place now. He had no regrets. On the morning of March 25th, while Bethany and Ruth sat on the sofa they had shared for thousands of ordinary hours, Reginald walked up behind them with the axe. He struck them, repeatedly according to the autopsies, until he was certain they were dead. He then attempted to execute the plan he had spent 14 days preparing. The bodies would not fit the bins as he had calculated. He retrieved the handsaw. But at 81 years old, even with 14 days of preparation, his body failed the ambition his planning had set. The bins, once loaded, were too heavy to move. He could not get them to the car. The scheme collapsed at its most critical point. So he spent the next hours doing what he could. He cut Bethany and Ruth's identification cards and social security documents into small pieces and walked them to the building dumpster, creating the appearance of a robbery, seeding the story he planned to tell. He cleaned the bathroom. He constructed his narrative around the gang-connected nephews. He staged the physical symptoms of a man in shock. And then, at 6 o'clock in the evening, 2 full hours after the doorbell camera had caught him calmly locking his door and walking to his car, he called 911. There is a layer to this case that the guilty verdict alone does not fully address, a layer that the defense tried to use as a shield, and that the prosecution dismantled with something almost insultingly straightforward. Reginald's legal team argued that he had been irrational, distraught, that witnesses had observed him behaving incoherently in the period leading up to the murders, that he had genuinely believed his family was facing destitution, and that this belief, however catastrophically misguided, had produced a kind of twisted mercy rather than cold-blooded murder. The prosecution brought the financial records. The McLarens were not broke. They had insurance policies, they had savings, they had income, they were current on their bills. The eviction they faced was a serious, stressful, genuinely difficult problem, but it was a solvable one. There were paths available that did not require an axe from a Home Depot tool aisle and a 14-day countdown. Bethany and Ruth McLaren did not die because their family was going to be homeless. They died because Reginald McLaren could not bring himself to ask for help, could not allow the women he claimed to love to witness him in the posture of a man who had failed to provide. He chose, deliberately, with 2 weeks of advance notice and a hardware store receipt to prove it, to position himself as their protector in the most savage, irreversible way imaginable, rather than stand before them as a human being who needed support. He called it mercy. The jury called it what it was. The trial took place in June 2024. The 14 days of premeditation, anchored permanently and undeniably by that March 9th Home Depot receipt, left the defense with no ground to stand on. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. On July 10, 2024, Reginald McLaren received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will die in a Colorado state prison. Ruth McLaren never became a lawyer, never stood in a courtroom on behalf of someone who needed her, never got to build the independent life she had been working so deliberately toward. Bethany McLaren never got the retirement she had earned, through military service, through decades of quiet sacrifice, through a lifetime of building something worth being proud of. 2 women who deserved more time, more future, more of the ordinary, irreplaceable hours that make a life worth living. This case leaves you with something that is difficult to set down. Because Reginald McLaren was not a stranger who broke through a window. He was not an intruder who came out of the darkness. He was the man who knew which key opened the door, who knew which closet sat near the boiler, who sat at the table with them and said "we," until quietly, without announcement, he stopped. The most dangerous thing in that apartment was never the axe. It was the man who bought it 2 weeks early and then went home for dinner. All details sourced from court records, 911 transcripts, body cam footage, interrogation records, trial testimony, and verified news reporting. Reginald McLaren was convicted June 2024 and sentenced July 10, 2024 to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.